Hello, this lesson is on frogs for Unit 6, Amphibians and Reptiles. I'll talk a little bit about their classification and what species are found in North Carolina, as well as their metamorphosis and the ecology and conservation. So they are, again, part of the kingdom Animalia. They are animals. They are in the phylum Chordata because they have a backbone. They are in the class Amphibia because they are amphibians, where they have a early aquatic larval stage and a mostly terrestrial adult stage, but still must reproduce in the water. And their order is Anura, which is going to be different from the salamanders and caecilians. We have almost 30 different species of frogs in North Carolina, and our state frog is actually, or state amphibian rather, is the Pine Barrens tree frog found here on the left, which is mostly going to be in sandhills, coastal plain areas with the longleaf pine forests, also found in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey and a few other places. So frogs and toads are a common distinction that most people make, where it's not exactly a scientific taxonomic difference, but it's a common trait that's very apparent and different between different frogs. Now, both frogs and toads are frogs, but frogs tend to be the ones that get the name with the very soft, moist skin, whereas the toads tend to get their name usually because they have the drier, more leathery kind of warty skin. And they often share some other traits as well. But some common species to find in North Carolina, one would be the American toad, something that everybody here has probably seen. It's the largest toad in North Carolina. It's found almost throughout North Carolina, with mostly in the Piedmont Mountains, as well as many other places in North America. And there's also a variety of subspecies. It's such a common species that there's a whole lot of variety of it in whatever locations it could be found, and they're spread throughout the continent. Another common frog that you might find is the green tree frog. It's pretty slender. You might find it all kind of tucked together on the side of a building or tree somewhere. Usually likes to be up high. And it's that bright green color with that yellow line that goes down the side there. You can find it here in Gaston County, but it's much more common out in the coastal plain, where it's probably going to be more humid and warm. And the Pine Barrens tree frog, again, our state amphibian. It's a pretty medium-sized, not very large frog, larger than, say, the peepers, or our smaller ones. Has a pretty limited distribution in North Carolina, as you can see, which has to do with the population decline, as we've learned about before, with the decline of the longleaf pine forest, which is its preferred habitat. And that's due to logging, agriculture, which is very prevalent in our coastal plain. But all these frogs are going to go through metamorphosis. There is that evolutionary history of them being tied to the water. So they start their life in water in these very jelly-like eggs that, if they were on land, they would dry out. The tadpoles, sometimes called polywogs, and they have some other names too, they have their tail kind of fin develop, and then eventually their limbs. But in the water, they can eat on algae, tiny little microinvertebrates that are almost microscopic, and they get eaten by anything else that might be hanging out in the water. So typically they like to lay these eggs in ponds, puddles, things that aren't lakes where they would find fish, ephemeral pools, as you might have heard about before. And then as they get older, they can develop limbs, and they'll venture out into the land where they can find more food, and also look for new mates potentially to reproduce with. If you stay in that small pond, that gene pool is not going to get a lot of variation. But by being an adult and moving away, you're not competing for the same food sources, and you're also being able to spread genes elsewhere into new ponds. Now, frogs are an important indicator species. Just like salamanders, they are going to have that permeable skin that absorbs pollution from the environment really easily. That leads to a lot of problems. As you can see here, this frog probably came into contact with a lot of nutrient pollution, like fertilizer coming off of a farm, or maybe even pesticides. And those kinds of pollutions can potentially lead to a lot of frog deformities. You may have seen a frog with multiple legs like this before. But frogs are important because they can tell us about those issues. They can help us with pest control. They're going to eat so many of those invertebrates that cause problems for our farms and even our own outdoor comfort. Frogs are very popular in research to develop medicine, and it's worthwhile conserving them. So a lot of conservation efforts tend to focus on counting frogs as well as measuring water quality, what's the pollution levels of fertilizer, pesticides, heavy metals, and pushing for better agricultural practices that can prevent a lot of those things from being run off into the local lakes and ponds and rivers. And that's it for today.